If there is no other comments, thank you very much, Sam. And we go to a final presentation of the day. And this is Neven, who is going to talk about procedural worlds and radical identity, gaming, meaning making, and extremism in contemporary society. Wow, that's a mouthful of a title, Neven, as usual.
Yeah, I'm the final boss, and I
You're
have to.
final, so you're going to do everything on everything.
So yeah, but it's
Mm.
and I'm now rethinking. Thank you. Like, first of all, thank you to everybody who answered
Yeah,
and who
Neven
came. And
doesn't need introduction, so I won't be going reading
no,
about who
I
you are.
don't need any.
You were communicating with everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, so just like thank to everybody that came, and and I'm sort of rethinking if I should have done a different presentation, but because my mentioned, I have an article that's coming on how Breivik, Tarrant, and Elliot, how they play their games. But I think I still wanted to test this presentation today simply because I think it sort of envelops a lot of things that were mentioned today, and because of it, it's more abstract than most of the stuff, and it's mostly still it's very theoretical. So and most importantly, these are not conclusions; they're more suggestions. Now repeat that as well in the presentation. So without further ado. Uh, so what I wanted to say is that digital gaming has become one of the most widespread cultural environments of the 21st century. For younger generations and all generations, gaming is no longer simply a form of entertainment. It is a routine site of social interaction, narrative immersion, and symbolic engagement. Scholarly work on gaming and extremism has largely focused on the presence of extremist actors within gaming ecosystems, the use of platforms for recruitment, or the circulation of all extremist imagery, etc., and all the stuff that we mentioned today. And while important, these questions treat gaming primarily as a communication medium. And as of recently, the issues related to the gamer as an identity. In that context, far less attention has been given to the possibility that gaming itself may function as a formative cultural environment, shaping how ideological meaning becomes plausible. The presentation therefore shifts the analytical lens in that direction. And what I suggest is a move from a radicalization in games to the relationship between gaming and identity formation as co-constitutive cultural forces. Put differently, if political and religious traditions have historically provided the architecture within which meaning becomes intelligible, what happens when those architectures weaken while large segments of multiple generations spend their formative years inhabiting synthetic, internally coherent universes? The argument advanced here is really diagnostic. I do not claim that gaming produces extremism. Rather, I suggest that prolonged immersion in synthetic worlds may normalize cognitive patterns historically associated with religious formation. And if so, gaming may help sustain the plausibility conditions within which totalizing political ideologies can take root. Now, let me begin by clarifying again what this argument is not. It is not a claim that games are a new religion or a direct psychological cause of antisocial behavior. Such arguments may be rhetorically satisfying, but they are analytically imprecise and perhaps flat out wrong. And I will talk a lot about religion here, and because it appears in discussion primarily because of its analytical relevance to extremism studies, and not just in terms of religious extremism. A long-standing body of scholarship interprets totalizing political movements, fascism and communism alike, as forms of political religion. They are systems that mobilize religious-like cosmologies, rituals, and teleological narratives in the service of political identity. My claim is modest, but perhaps unsettling. Gaming may have normalized the cognitive and symbolic patterns historically associated with religious formation and, by extension, political extremism. To understand this, we must return to the classical sociology of religion. Emil Durkheim understood religion as a system of shared symbols binding a community. Max Weber emphasized ultimate horizons. And perhaps equally relevant, if not more, is Peter Berger's concept of plausibility structures, the context or background conditions that render certain beliefs credible. Religious and extremist cosmologies do not persuade solely or at all through doctrinal coherence. They persuade because they're embedded within worlds that make them experientially intelligible. They make sense. Every successful digital game constructs exactly this kind of metaphysical horizon. This is not metaphorical, it is design architecture. Entities like the Chaos Marines or the Emperor of Mankind in Warhammer 40,000 do not function as mere content. They function because of the cosmological scaffolding that makes them intelligible. If you remove the objective reality within the game of corruption or the rules of the warp, the narrative within 40K collapses fully. Gamers, most of them anyway, demand that their synthetic worlds be logically and cosmologically consistent. And in that sense, possess a low tolerance for what I call a ludonarrative dissonance. This demand for internally coherent worlds, in fact, mirrors the systematic thinking that radical political movements seek to cultivate. If extremist movements function as political religions, then procedural worlds constructed by digital games may help sustain the cognitive conditions within which such systems remain intelligible. Thus, Faber argues that digital games provide a procedural training of sorts in categories such as teleology, moral alignment, ritual, and symbolic cosmology, areas that were once the almost exclusive domain of religious tradition and philosophy. As game design theorists consistently note, a digital game cannot function without a coherent teleology, an evaluative moral grammar, ritualized action loops, and a symbolic cosmology that renders the world intelligible. These are not thematic flourishes, but structural requirements of game design. Without them, a game collapses into incoherence or ceases to be a game at all. First, teleology. It is a widely accepted proposition that much of late modern life is characterized by a lack of overarching purpose, a sense of accidental existence, if you will. Games, by contrast, are inherently teleological. They are structured around a narrative progression towards ultimate ends, defeating a final adversary, restoring balance, or completing a cosmic quest. Or in this case, this is a flowchart how to get all romances in Mass Effect 1. Players inhabit worlds in which every action is ordered towards a transcendent objective. This habituates the participant to the idea that the world is about something, that there is a goal to be reached and a logic to the journey. In a disenchanted world, games offer a site of re-enchantment through purpose, a craving frequently weaponized by extremist recruiters. Second, moral alignment. Games frequently encode value structures into their very mechanics. Systems of virtue and corruption, or lawful versus chaotic alignments, distinguish the righteous from the fallen. Even in games that reject explicit binaries, communal norms emerge within guilds and factions. Shared expectations govern conduct. Transgressions produce sanction. The participant is not merely observing a moral debate, they are navigating a world where good and evil have tangible and mechanical consequences. You cannot play the same game in the same way depending on where you position yourself morally. Third, ritualized repetition. We see this in daily quests, weekly resets, and scheduled raids. These recurring patterns, they generate a sense of communal belonging, creating temporal rhythms that mirror a liturgical calendar. Absence produces marginality. Participation reinforces status within the sacred order. A game's life cycle functions as a contemporary liturgy of the hours. Finally, symbolic cosmologies. Entire universes are constructed with internally coherent lore. A player must master the history, hierarchies, and metaphysics of a game world to thrive. This develops a capacity for symbolic reasoning, normalizing the idea that reality should be governed by invisible rules and master narrative arcs. It is tempting to draw a direct line from earlier forms of literally world building, like Tolkien, for example, to contemporary gaming. Yet the difference, in fact, lies in immersion. Readers and viewers observe worlds, and gamers inhabit them. Furthermore, many gamers become co-creators. We see this most vividly in the modding communities. Few cultural artifacts illustrate this more clearly than Skyrim. Since 2011, its staggering ecosystem of user-generated modifications has completely rewritten inventories, physics systems, political structures, and narrative logics. You can play Skyrim without ever playing Skyrim if you download enough mods. This suggests that large numbers of individuals are becoming accustomed to navigating and constructing internally coherent metaphysical systems. To be provocative, through modding, the community has learned what it means to be a demiurge, possessing agency over the laws of a world. This impulse is closely mirrored to in the extremist desire to aggressively tear down and reconstruct society. Synthetic environments invite a collaborative cosmology that grants the individual a taste of demiurgic authority over reality. We must therefore treat gaming not merely as escapism, but as civilizational infrastructure, the social imaginary made tangible through code, vectors, and pixels. However, recognizing gaming as culturally formative obliges us to examine its darker and extractive dimensions. We cannot romanticize these synthetic worlds without acknowledging that they are increasingly structured around microtransactional economies designed for continuous psychological optimization. What moral imagination is formed when predatory fiscal mechanisms are embedded within spaces of belonging? A ritual repetition becomes monetized, advancement becomes purchasable. In the same procedural systems that normalize teleology also normalize extraction with pay-to-win systems, essentially divinizing monetary wealth as the master commodity. The sociology of radicalization cannot ignore this ambivalence. It is also difficult to consider renewed ideological susceptibility among younger generations without acknowledging the institutional failures that preceded it. Civic and religious institutions have largely struggled to transmit symbolic literacy in a compelling way. Scandals have eroded moral authority, and cultural capital has diminished. If alternative environments now succeed in cultivating narrative immersion and existential orientation, scholars must take notice. Whether gaming inadvertently performs a form of cultural seeding by normalizing the demand for hermetically sealed meaning systems remains an open question. It is an irony of our age, in fact, that the human appetite for totalizing meaning is being kept alive not through intentional civic formation, but through participation in synthetic worlds that the state neither authored nor controls, despite recent attempts. Now, we can ground this structural theory into two brief case studies. First, I would like to rethink secularization a little bit. For much of the late 20th century, secularization functioned as the master narrative. Yet, metaphysical thinking hasn't vanished. It is arguably displaced into individualized hybrid environments. Institutional affiliation may have weakened, but metaphysical curiosity persists. The spiritual bricolage increasingly replaces confessional inheritance. In effect, very similar to the salad bar extremism. You have the same phenomenon happening within religions as well. And crucially, we must also acknowledge the migration of symbolic capital. Historically, religious traditions and national traditions have supplied the shared symbolic vocabularies of a culture. Today, we are witnessing a moment where traditional saints and national heroes share imaginative spaces with digital characters whose narratives reach rivals mythic archetypes. To put it bluntly, very few 20-year-olds in post-Christian West can recount the feats of Saint Michael or the life of Saint Joan of Arc, let alone Saint Olga of Kiev. On the other hand, nearly all can identify Chun-Li, Doomguy, or Lara Croft. This observation is not intended as a cultural lament. It is simply descriptive. Symbolic authority is migrating. Scholars have long tracked such migrations from the temple to the court to the book, but the scale of this migration into digital procedural world is unprecedented. This is where synthetic worlds become analytically relevant. Long-term immersion in these symbolically dense environments preserve a cognitive comfort with metaphysical architecture. In fact, these dynamics matter because totalizing political narratives, including extremist ones, do not persuade by doctrine alone. As I mentioned earlier, they persuade by providing worlds. If synthetic worlds help preserve the plausibility conditions of spirituality and religion, then extremist ideologies understood as political religions may also find them find in them a cultural environment within which their narratives remain cognitively familiar and compelling. In other words, if gaming does a service by providing a space within which spirituality and religion remains intelligible, then political religion can take advantage of that same space as well. And this is where our second case study comes in handy. It looks, in fact, to South Korea, one of the most technologically connected societies in the world. And crucially, the 20 to 21 to 29 age group records the highest share of gamers at over 85%. So over 85% of all 29-year-olds in Korea play games. This situates a massive and relevant portion of the younger generation inside environments that routinely normalize adversarial competition, factional alignment, and rule-governed conflict. Within this exact same generational cohort, recent elections have revealed a pronounced, highly polarized political divergence between young men and young women. What makes this shift highly relevant here is where this political identity was formed. The grievances driving young men, such as anxieties over economic hypercompetition, mandatory military service, and perceived reverse discrimination, were heavily cultivated within male-dominated spaces and gaming forums and digital subcultures. In these spaces, complex socioeconomic anxieties are often flattened into the procedural binary logic we see in gaming: clear adversaries, zero-sum competition, and rigid moral alignments. While gaming participation is far from exclusive to men, South Korea highlights an intriguing and structural convergence. The same demographic cohort most deeply embedded in gaming environments is the same cohort between which political identities have recently crystallized most sharply. And with this, I will conclude and by restating the central proposal. If synthetic worlds are reshaping the symbolic environments within which younger generations and older generations orient themselves, security and extremism studies must widen its analytical lens. Digital gaming must be understood as a technology of world construction at an unprecedented scale. Yet, the structural features discussed today, the however moment as well, the teleology, the moral alignment, and symbolic cosmology should not be understood only as vulnerabilities. In fact, they're mostly not that prime openness to totalizing ideologies. They may also function as resilience factors against incoherent ideologies. By habituating players to expect internally consistent worlds, games may cultivate a cognitive sensitivity to contradictions. When ideological systems fail to maintain coherence, that is, when moral alignments appear hypocritical or theological narratives collapse, gamers are primed to disengage. Gaming, in fact, could train a form of cognitive allergy to flawed ideological architectures. In other words, ideologies must play well to remain compelling. If they do not, they are rejected and often become meme fodder. The task, again, is, as I said, is diagnostic. And several avenues for future research suggest themselves. Empirical studies on correlations between gaming exposure and political narratives being one, qualitative studies of symbolic reasoning among gaming native cohorts being second, sociological engagement with procedural architectures of meaning being the third one, and finally, an analysis of ritualized online behavior as vectors for radicalization. How often does it play a factor? And these are only some that I kind of listed off the top of my head, but and I'm welcome to to discuss anything else. And finally, what I said are not conclusions. They are invitations. Invitations to determine whether we have in fact underestimated the environment in which radical belief itself becomes thinkable. Now, if we are to understand the ideological imagination of the 21st century, we must take seriously the world within which that imagination has largely been formed, because gaming is worth more than movies, books, and music combined. So if I were to put it in three sentences, I would say not extremism in games, it's gaming and identity, and the horizons of belief that emerge between them. Thank you.